Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Matthias Nordvig. I am the head of Nordic Studies at the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures here at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And I will be serving as the moderator for today. For recording purposes, I will just state that today's date is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026. The panel time is 4 p.m. And the panel title is Risky Business, the Strategic Game of Geopolitical Conquests. Now, before we get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder's, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on traditional territories and ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you, and once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. Before we go ahead with that, let me just note that we ask that all our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. And please also remember to put your phones on silent mode. Now, time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take our questions via handwritten note cards, and please raise your hand if you have a question, and our producer will give you a note card and a pencil. And please write legibly, and then raise your hand when you have completed the card, and the producer will come around and collect it and bring them to me, and then I will be able to read them for you. And now, I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I remind our audience that full speaker bios are available online on CWA's website. And so, let's begin with Paul.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I've had a wonderful 2 days meeting new people and learning a whole lot of new things. I'm a scientist, and so I come at this with the training of a scientist, with the logical thinking and the empirical, sort of evidence-based approach. And you might say, why is a scientist sitting in a session with geopolitical conquests? And I'll try to explain that in the next hour or so. I have a couple thoughts on that. I've studied landscapes around the world: South America, Brazil, Bolivia, Africa, the Middle East, and most recently the Arctic. And my focus has been on how humans and landscapes interact, particularly on the hazards that landscapes can cause to humans and their civilizations: erosion, landslides, sea level rise. I'm very deeply interested in snow, ice, glaciers, and things frozen. And of late, particularly in the behavior of Greenland and its ice. And I like to say, when that ice melts, and the ice is melting today, sea level rises and people's lives around the world are impacted. And so in that way, you might think about Greenland as having these large arms, and those large arms are geopolitical in their definition because they do affect the entire world. Or some people might say what happens in Greenland doesn't stay in Greenland. The last decade, I have focused very intently on science communication. Maybe it's my age, maybe it's watching what's happened in our country here. But I think the power of evidence in the face of disinformation and misinformation is really important. And so that's been another part of my deep dive into Greenland, but also is just the sheer wonder of the place. It's an absolutely amazing place. And certainly, if you live in the United States, and even if you don't, it has become central to our news cycle in the last year. So I look forward to speaking with these folks and to exchanging ideas about geopolitical conquests.
So good afternoon. I'm Ernesto Araújo. I'm a career diplomat from the Brazilian Diplomatic Service. Before that, I graduated in literature and linguistics, so I come from the humanities studies. And I served as a Brazilian foreign minister between 2019 and 2021. And after that, I went on a leave, some sort of sabbatical leave. And now I teach an online course on basically geopolitics, or what I like to call logo politics, from logos, which of course has to do with philosophy, thinking, logic, of course. And I have a few participations in podcasts as well in my YouTube channel. Since it's already the, I think, third day, right? Or fourth? Third day, at least that I'm here. It's my third panel. We start to feel like family, right? So just to share something with you about what I do. A couple of years ago, my daughter, she's in college, she was then in high school. One day I asked her, where do you tell your friends when they ask what I do? She said, oh, I say you're a YouTuber. Right? So that's what I am. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Meghna. I'm Meghna Gohatakurta from Bangladesh. I've studied and taught international relations for more than 20 years at the University of Dhaka. So, but lately I was also heading a research organization specializing in action research. So we don't only investigate things, but also do some actions. And those were participatory action research with very marginalized communities in Bangladesh. So people who are ethnic in origin or they are religiously different from the majority people, and culturally different also. So looking at diversity, I also looked at diversity like biodiversity as well in our country. And with marginalized communities, I found that they live more in touch with nature than we do, and hence know a lot more and understand nature much more. And I learned from that. And I think it is this learning which I try to bring to my old profession of international relations. And I know about geopolitics from day one because and this is something which I have come to learn, that now we usually, in our college studies, we usually have a language which is mandatory, like English or the vernacular. But I think nowadays, in today's world, it is very important to learn also international relations as a basic topic. IR 101, everywhere, to everyone. Or else we will not know the horizons, the new horizons that our worlds are entering. I hope to learn more from this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. So I'm hoping to facilitate a organic conversation about these central topics that are on the table today. And so for that purpose, I will start by asking the question, what do each of you see as the greatest threat to international security and economic prosperity today at this moment? And I will start by moving that question directly to my left side. Paul, please.
I'm probably going to answer this differently than the other two folks on this panel. I'm going to say the greatest threat to international security and peace right now is actually our Earth. And I'm going to say that in the context of a changing climate and of melting ice sheets. Because if we were to allow the Greenland ice sheet to melt or a significant part of the Antarctic ice sheet to melt, sea levels are going to rise, and they're going to rise many meters, and they've already started on that rise. And the coastal infrastructure of the entire world is critical for national security, and it's critical for international relations. 5 of the 11 American aircraft carriers are based at Newport News. It's already flooding. The prediction is that the entire base within the next 30 years is likely to be underwater during a major hurricane. That's a direct impact on American national security if we have no place to berth our aircraft carriers. And it spreads around the world. Again, if the Greenland ice sheet were to be allowed to melt completely, we would look at something on the order of 500 million people being displaced. Think about that for a minute. Think about what migration has done to our societies in the last decade and the political response to it and the instability that's come from that. Now imagine 500 million people who do not have homes, do not have a place to farm, do not have a place to live. So I take a very different lens on this as a geoscientist who studies Earth, but I think we are in trouble in terms of the relationship between people and the planet. Some of that is climate, but some of that is land use and deforestation and desertification. And I think we've got to think a little bit harder about taking care of our planet in order to take care of the people on our planet.
Thank you. Well, to answer the question, I will venture a take which is kind of goes in another direction. My hypothesis is that the Cold War never ended. The fact is that the United States or the democratic West just did not fight that war during 30, 35 years, but the war was always there, never ended, and now the United States is fighting that war against the forces of totalitarianism, which changed the shape a little bit, not a lot, from the what we call the Cold War. And the greatest threat in that regard would be not realizing that that war is going on and reverting to that sort of benign or not so benign neglect and think, oh, you have one problem here in the world, another conflict there, but those things are not related. Okay, we can go on with our lives like our democratic societies were not in danger. So I would say that is the question of epistemology, if you want, right? How we perceive reality, how we combine facts in our heads to extract the best conception of the truth, and also a question of the nerve to face those challenges. Thank you.
I think if I boil it down to this, it'll be the greatest threat would be individual greed and consumption. When I went one day, I went to the indigenous community in our, what we call the Chittagong Hill Tracts, where indigenous community, as you know, your Aboriginals, your First Nation also did not have private property. They had lands which they shared with community property. So there was this guy who, and they are now threatened by our own governments and the military, who are very interested in accruing their land and occupying it. So there was a small placard in this house, and it said, "This house belongs to Jesus." And we wondered, we asked him, why do you write that? He said, well, it's not my house because it's not my property. It's Jesus' house. Jesus will defend it. Because he himself found himself totally unable to defend his property because of the powerful, the strong forces of military and the government. Unless we do that, unless we recognize the value of sharing of what little we have, and increasingly they will become little, we will not be able to live with each other, and we will perpetually go to war with each other. And that will not be a very good way to live, I think.
So I really like both of your statements, and they really hit home to me, and I actually think they're connected in a way that I hadn't realized before. I've spent the last 5 or 6 years studying a U.S. military base built inside the Greenland ice sheet, a place called Camp Century. It's like science fiction, but it isn't fiction, where they put 200 men inside the ice sheet. And it was based on Cold War fears of the Russians coming over the top, and that we needed a position to guard the United States and Canada. They did amazing things. This is the Army Corps of Engineers. These are scientists. These are Army folks. Things that we would never imagine. And this is happening at the same time we're building the space program and going to the moon for the beginning. But I look at that time and I look at the wonder and the excitement about science and the excitement about engineering and what we did as a society then to move forward. Because we had the Cold War as a villain, we had the Soviet Union and communism as a villain, but yet it united a very fractious American society in some ways if we think back to the 60s, right? And today, I don't think we have that shared purpose in this country. We are as divided as I've seen in my 64 years on the planet here. And I'm, in many ways, Ernesto, liking your idea that the Cold War never ended, but we kind of think it ended, and our response to it ended, and what replaced it, what was exactly what you said, which is greed. And we've lost this collective shared purpose, and it's become individual greed from that. So I thank you both for that, because I think it's a really interesting observation.
Great. So to keep to what Paul was saying, and also to give a couple of examples of why I think the Cold War never ended. First, I have here a copy of a very interesting book called Red Cocaine by Ray Klein, which was published in 1990, right when they were beginning to think that the Cold War had ended, but this concept had not taken shape yet. Soviet Union was still on its feet, like kind of. So it's about how, according to a lot of research, a lot of documentation, the Soviet Union was the main source and was responsible for a, let's say, hybrid warfare program against the United States that brought drug trafficking and drug use, drug trafficking and production to Latin America, and drug use in a massive scale to the United States. That also involved China back then, and that also involved Cuba back then. But it was a program, according to this author, curiously called Дружба народов, which translates as friendship of peoples. So the Soviets always very able to coat their warfare in good-sounding euphemisms or ideals. Right? just to give an idea, I'll read the list of chapters. So first, the Chinese initiative. 2, the Soviet decision. 3, building the Latin American drug network. 4, Khrushchev instructs the satellites. And goes on and on. The hypothesis is that this started around 1964. And when you look at things, you see that, drug trafficking and drug consumption skyrocketed from that point. I also think, in a parallel note, that the cultural revolution in the West, the revolution in behavior and everything, has a lot to do with the Marxist cultural revolution that started in China. To a certain extent, I think it was planted from outside. It was also a hybrid warfare operation of the communist bloc. So basically, you had the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba involved. And what you see today is that drug trafficking as a way of constructing a power base against the United States, against democracy, against the peoples of Latin America is still on, is still going on. Cuba is still the center of that, as long as that regime remains in power. Venezuela was, and still is, and could become again, if the US doesn't take that threat seriously, could become again a platform for drug trafficking as, in a way, an attack on the United States. So Cuba is still there, the same castrist communist regime. China, 1964, Mao Zedong. Now, okay, Xi Jinping. No, Xi Jinping is just a continuator of Mao Zedong. China never had a break of its communist, Maoist fundamental structure. They're just pursuing their objectives in a different way. But Russia is completely different from the Soviet Union. Russia is ruled by a former KGB agent and former head of the KGB, under a different name back then, but it's basically run in a KGB style. So I think the actors are all there. The other example is in Argentina. So I'm talking about 64, now I'm talking about last week or 10 days ago, in Argentina, the Argentinian government of Javier Milei found that Russia was, and there's an abundance of proof for that, was carrying an operation whereby Russia was paying Argentinian journalists to run articles against Javier Milei. Okay, why? Because Milei is a staunch defender of the Ukraine, but I think more than that, because Milei is aligning Argentina with the democratic West and especially with the United States. So I think those are different instruments of the same war. Okay. I don't want to go too much, but just to to give those two examples.
Well, I'd like to sort of look at it in a different way, which is whether we talk about Cold War, which was really looking at bipolar world, and before that we had the balance of power. So it was one kind of balance that we had, and then we supposed to have this unipolar world and all that, and now we're it's being talked of that we're going in towards another multipolar worlds. Whatever it means power base. Now, the power base of states. And states, in a previous panel, even in this room, we were talking about sovereignty and nation, and the concepts are changing. And I find that there are three factors now, which was not there before. It was there, but in a different, it did not override concepts of sovereignty. But now we are finding that what used to be called border disputes are no longer border disputes, but they are something else. And what are the three driving forces that are new that we have to take into account. One is, of course, immigration, that with globalization, labor, we had developed this one world economic order and a new economic order. And that meant labor would be free, capital would be free. But labor, cheap labor would go from one place to another, and the needs would be fulfilled by this. So immigration has been one factor. Technology, cyberspace is another space that we have to look at, which is kind of intervening with this concept of borders. And what it used to be called, I think it used to be called at one time, and borders which had been creating cartographic anxieties. That's what they said, cartographic anxieties, fears. Whose fears, you know? But we know that it's not all, sometimes it is the elite who fears, sometimes it is whose fear is it that is being reflected in a state, even within a state. So we have to look at this. Technology is, of course, informatics, which is our internet and the AI and the algorithmic kind of transformation that we are looking at, which is influencing our policies in the ways that we never thought they would before. And of course, the other factor, slowly but surely grabbing us all, is climate change, which is overriding all the borders. And in fact, nowadays, and that is very interesting because no longer do we retain that sovereignty. Okay, first of all, in terms of sovereignty, it was Europe who showed the way. We had the concept of fortress Europe. And then they had Brexit. And then now we have ICE. So, I mean, there are different forms of this whole, the borders that are assuming new directions, and we don't know what to do with them. We just don't know. And the other thing is, but in certain cases, and we have to look at not only negative developments, but also there has been certain positive, and since you are, you're well versed in the climate change and the way it's developing, I've heard that in the Italy and Hungary, I think, or another European country, I forgot, have developed the concept of movable borders, which is glacial change, and they're measuring the glacier. We are still, with India, Bangladesh is still measuring waters, sharing of waters, but that has been an environmental, and it's bound to remain, still. But here you're talking about glacial meltdowns and how borders are shifting, and they're setting up monitors. And so it's even factoring in our international law. So all these changes are indications which we don't look at when we decide when to cross a border or when not to cross a border. So border disputes are no longer the traditional border disputes. If it's not, then it's easy to get into Venezuela and grab their president and bring them here. Or even in our own South Asians, there has been many excursions of Indian Army going into Nepal and Maldives and on border strikes. So, I mean, these are factors which we really have to look upon, and we haven't invested our academic efforts into these yet. I think we should.
I think that's a fascinating idea of these fluid borders, and I want to take it maybe we'll build on that anyway. As sea level rises, there are entire countries that are going to cease to exist and parts of countries that are going to cease to exist. And if we want to reflect on our own country here, as sea level rises, at some point New Orleans is just simply not going to be viable. It's too far underwater. And Boston will turn into a series of islands. But the real issues are with low-lying countries, particularly at the edge of continents and in ocean basins. And on that, I want to return to Cuba, because I think you and I may have had very different perspectives and experiences in Cuba. I grew up in the United States through the Cold War. I was born in 1961, and everything I heard about Cuba as a child and as a young adult was negative. And it was a Russian satellite, and there were nuclear weapons there, and we were going to be threatened. And then I had the opportunity in 2018 and 19 and the beginning of 20 to travel to Cuba and do field work. And it changed the way I thought about the world, not because of the Cuban government, because of the Cuban people that I worked with and the science team that I worked with. And it was my first real effort at public science communication, and I wrote it on the airplane back from Cuba because I was so impressed with the philosophy of this Cuban team, about a dozen people we worked with. It was horizontal, it wasn't vertical. And the first day we went to the field and we were sampling for water quality and we were sampling around erosion and the effects of organic agriculture, the first day we went to the field, the director of a 100-person lab was the first person in the stream grabbing samples. And I knew this would never happen in the United States. That person would never have left their office, but they were with us. They insisted on coming in the vans, on the donkey carts, on the roads, and showing us their country. And I'd never been with a science team that had no hierarchy. And every place I looked in Cuba, I didn't see what I'd been taught as a child. And it was incredibly confusing to this view of the world that I had grown up through. And I realized at that point that perhaps the way these people did science and the way they interacted reflected the government of Cuba. And then I also noticed, why were we in the United States so worried and paranoid about a country where half the people were getting around on donkeys and horses? And I just didn't get the threat as a scientist. And I've gone back repeatedly, and I've had nothing but the warmest response from the people of Cuba. And I am saying the people because that's very different than the government. But I think we forget that sometimes. And we think about the world and strategy and geopolitics as being the government, but underneath all those governments are people. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that we're talking about these big ideas, but really, I made friends with folks I never would have made friends with before, and I learned something because they did come under a different cultural system. And so I didn't feel the Cold War when I was in Cuba at all. And maybe I missed something, but in a couple weeks in Cuba, it was the most peaceful, friendly, supportive time I've ever had in a foreign country, and the least threatened I ever felt. I walked anywhere all the time, and people would run up and say, "American?" and give me a big hug. I don't speak much Spanish, they didn't speak much English, but there was this connection that shocked me because I thought, they're going to hate me. I'm an American, we've embargoed your country since 1961, but they didn't at all.
Well, a few considerations. I think this is a great debate. The question of bipolar, multipolar, unipolar world, I think diplomats love that sort of language and discuss those concepts, and they always say, no, we cannot have a unipolar world. They say, oh, the bipolar world was not that good. Unipolar world is very bad, so we need a multipolar world. I think those are words. Right? What are the facts? I want to know what the poles are. Right? If you have a good pole and a bad pole, I don't mind the bad pole disappearing and having a unipolar world. If you have a bipolar or multipolar world and 4 of the 5 are united against the one to bring about a totalitarian regime all over the world, I don't think multipolarity is a good thing. So that's one aspect. Another, well, of course, one thing is that if you start from the supposition that every country, every regime is just out there to improve the lives of their citizens one way or another with different systems. And another is if you assume that some of those countries are out there to destroy your freedom, to destroy your way of life. Right? I think this second one is harder to face, but is more true. than the other one. Of course, our tendency is not to face the hard facts. So the idea, China only wants to do business. Russia, okay, they just want to restore a few of the territories of the Soviet Union. Iran just what? They just went to destroy Israel, right? It's not my problem because I'm not Israel. Some people think like that. I don't think like that. I think they went much more than that, and that's not good for whoever, not only Western countries, but for whoever likes freedom in the world. It's not good for their people, especially. Specifically regarding Venezuela, Magda mentioned the capture of Nicolás Maduro. I know many people think that was against international law, a violation of sovereignty. And Magda also talked about the need to, not specifically about that, if I understood correctly, but the need of more academic study about that sort of situation, sovereignty, borders. Okay, so my suggestion, a good academic team to go to Venezuela and do field work with real Venezuelans to find out what they think, what they thought of Maduro, and what they think of the capture of Maduro, and what they want to happen next. I would venture to say, from the experience I have talking with Venezuelan friends, is that a huge majority of Venezuelans would say that the intervention was too little, right? And they want more people to be captured and for a real transition to democracy to take place, which then comes back to Cuba and the question of the people. I think the people is what matters, right? The people is what matters. If the Cuban people are happy, okay, right? But I don't think they're happy. Maybe the people who you had contact with were happy. I don't know if they were pre-selected by the government to give that impression to you. The Soviets did that all the time with academic people from the West, right? And they convinced a lot of academics that Stalinist Russia was a paradise or didn't have many problems. That Stalin was just an authoritarian, but. Why? Because they selected the real Russians that came to meet and work with foreigners. I don't know if that's the case. The case I know is, I think 2 years ago, I remember it was in July, there was a big revolt of Cubans across the island against the regime, badly repressed, the government killed people, the government imprisoned people without any sort of legal trial or anything like that. So, yeah, and why they are there for so long, oppressing people that way, and people can't change that sort of regime because they're part of the Cold War, because they were sustained by the Soviet Union, because they did immense service to the cause of the communist project of power worldwide, including apparently bringing drug trafficking to South America. I know in Brazil what Cuban agents did and are doing now. You have Cuban agents working to increase the power of a totally corrupt system in Brazil. They infiltrated lots of Brazilian institutions, right? Always with that sort of, I think, a good image. Oh, we're fighters for the poor, and Cuba is, okay, we're a poor revolutionary country, you know, and that's the way they brought the worst violence, the worst kind of crime across the hemisphere, and that's going on today. Right. So I think it's very much on the Cold War, yes.
So I just want to say quickly, if I heard you right, part of the problem with Cuba was arrests without warrants, was imprisonment of people without warrants. That's happening in our country right now. So why shouldn't there be an intervention where, as we snatched Maduro, what if somebody walks into the United States and snatches our president? Is that internationally legal? And I realize I'm out of my lane as a geologist, but I've watched this country in the last year, and I see things happening in here that I never saw happening in Cuba in my weeks there. I never saw a person with a gun in Cuba, and I don't think I was shielded because I would get up at 6 in the morning and I would walk miles around the towns and villages we were in just to see where I was. I never saw a firearm, and now I turn on the television in the United States, and there are men with rifles taller than I am walking around, and they're in airports. And I don't recognize the country I'm in from that point right now. And people breaking down doors in our hometown in Burlington with a warrant, and guess what? No one in that house was named on that warrant, and they arrested everybody in it anyway. And the federal judges released them within a couple days, but I'm seeing this kind of authoritarianism in a country that I grew up in, and I am still proud of, but I'm shocked at what's happening here. And that to me is it's a violation of our rights in this country. And if I see authoritarianism, it's right here and it's local right now. And I don't know how to deal with that as a citizen except to raise my voice. And I have where I have expertise, which is in climate and is in understanding the ice sheet and is in supporting science and the evidence-based parts of science. And I've written extensively about that. I don't know how to deal with our political system as it is, but I'm very curious, especially from the two of you, to hear what it looks like from outside the United States.
Don't forget to turn on your mic.
No, I think, yes, the world is changing, and one of the things that I think we have to look for answers and perhaps positive directions. From my point, where I am in Asia, for example, we have to look at our giants. I mean, I know Brazil is kind of a giant in Latin America, but we have two giants. Bangladesh is size-wise a very small country, but it is a nation of 180 million people, with a density of population next only to China. And we have two giants. One is China, one is India. India is all around Bangladesh. So, yes, but you know this. I've always found this. Why can't we live with both? Both are, very important civilizations, and they have great history. We are part of both the histories. We are Eastern. Our philosophies agree with each other, and but the fact is that I've always used it more as a cynical thing than more as a cynical statement. When I go to the Indians and they are very afraid of China, I always tell them that, well, why do you have to be afraid of them? You're both Islamophobic countries. I mean, and they get shocked. What? I said, yes, I'm not a Muslim, but I can afford to say that to them, but I am a minority in a Muslim majority country, and I'm still living there. And okay, there are problems sometimes, but then why should I, look at my own people as my enemies? So here also, I think we have to the point of inclusionary mindset in our foreign policies. That is something that we still have to pursue, and we have to convince our diplomatic corps and our policymakers that it is important that you do not bring, in pen and paper they don't bring it in. In pen and paper they are very diplomatic, but it's true that, I remember the Chinese ambassador in Bangladesh, they, once when we talked about Uyghur, and they said, no, we don't talk about that. Previously, they didn't say anything because they didn't know English, but our Chinese ambassadors are greatly, their level of English has soared skyrocketed. Their level of understanding of the world is, really has changed so much. So we have to acknowledge these realities. I was in Malaysia working with the Chinese communities in Malaysia. And even then, although the Chinese communities in Malaysia, they still have relatives living in the Chinese mainland. And China, even then, this was the beginning of 2000, the millennium. They still had policies then to give extra concession, banking, privileges for money and resources to be transferred to Chinese mainland. And Chinese in Malaysia are quite wealthy, and they are, although there is a kind of policy which asks them to partner with Malays, but still they are quite wealthy people, and they got this privilege. And China got the privilege of taking their investment and building up their mainland. So we have to look towards policies which work and policies which don't work. And I think the Chinese at that time have very cleverly been fashioning their foreign policy towards this end, and perhaps we can learn from it. I think India can learn from it, definitely.
Thank you so much for your comments. We are approaching that moment where we would like to take some questions from the audience. I have one here. A student who is asking, we have heard about Venezuela, Greenland, Taiwan, Canada, and others being taken over for gain, or the intention to take them over for gain. What do you think is next that has not been covered in the news yet? Please make your predictions.
I think from what I hear and see and try to study, the United States now has this program, which I think is extremely interesting, which is called the Shield of the Americas, which is basically a coalition of countries from across the hemisphere to fight organized crime, which is the main problem for peoples in the hemisphere, especially if you conceive organized crime in a broad perspective, which includes corruption, which it does. So in Brazil, if you see the polls among Brazilians, people are asked what is the main problem of the country, and number one and number two are always corruption and crime, which is basically the same thing. It's not the economy or other issues, although the economy is also bad. But I think that's a game changer for Latin American countries, for my country for sure. If Brazil one day is today, not thinking about that because they're totally anti-American, but and anti-Brazilian. That's the problem. But if one day Brazil joins that in the near future, I think this could help bring the changes that the country needs, which is to get rid of totally widespread corruption and organized crime. So I think that's, of course, what's next. Of course, I think people are thinking, oh, something that would violate sovereignty of countries. Okay, from a different perspective. I come from this perspective. Generally, actions of this administration in the West, across the world, are in the sense of increasing freedom, increasing democracy, increasing prosperity and perspectives of prosperity for countries. That's for sure the question of Latin America. And again, I advise, I suggest field studies with real people, not people pre-selected by their governments, by their regimes, but with real people in Latin American countries, what they think of U.S. attitudes now. Thank you.
So I think my bet would be two places, but to put that in the context, I think Antarctica and I think the deep sea. There's been a lot of noise about mining the deep sea, and Antarctica has always been an international place, but there's increasing noise about whether or not we should be extracting wealth from both of those places. But I would reflect back, and I think you mentioned this early on, that a lot of this is about greed, and it's about accumulating wealth, and it's about disparities in the world in terms of wealth. And in this country in the last year, there's been a lot of noise about crime, but when you look at the statistics, it's not there. It's a cover story for everything else. And so we haven't seen spikes in murder rate, and yet the National Guard was sent into DC, right? And so I think we have to find a way to get the real information about what's going on, and I don't know how to do it. I can read, and extensively I can read reports. I can think I know the truth, but then what you hear through the government doesn't match that. And so I think it's a real challenge as Americans right now to sort out what's real and what's noise. And I think a lot of the noise is coming out of our government at this point. But I would predict you're going to see noise about the Antarctic, the deep sea, and working within other nations' territorial waters, which we are already seeing around the world. And that to me is really frightening. It's frightening as a citizen, but as somebody who has studied the Earth and studied the environment, I'll come back to the introduction I made on this. I really think the biggest threat to global security is our inability to take care of the planet we live on. And I think it's going to come back and bite us. And I don't know if it's going to be 10 years or 100 years, but I really fear for this planet in terms, we were talking about this last night, of with somebody who was an economist who was very different than I met here, but was saying, look, we can feed the entire world. We just got to stop eating meat and feeding that food to animals. And he's vegetarian, and we were having this back and forth. I'm not vegetarian. And I said, yeah, we can, but why can we? Because of synthetic nitrogen and fossil fuels. And what happens if we lose those fossil fuels? We can no longer make that synthetic nitrogen, and 8.3 billion people now live on this planet. How are we going to feed them? And have we put ourselves out in this precarious place that in Vermont we would say means you're out over your skis, which is you're about to crash throttling down the mountain. But I really worry that we have gone beyond the normal carrying capacity of this Earth because we rely on fossil fuels. And at some point, if something disturbs that, is it another pandemic? Is it a giant solar flare that knocks out our electrical systems and our computer chips? What happens? And that, to me, is the greatest strategic worry we're facing.
I don't want to answer that question, but reframe it, that what can we do against, thinking like this? Where do we stop? And I find the answer is in institutions, and whether you mention trafficking, drugs, or whether the lack of democratic practice, if we ruin our institutions, then we're bound to be made vulnerable to attack. And even I was attending the panel on constitutional crisis and the presidency and the rule of law. And and everyone, whatever their opinions were, they came into one that we have to go back to we the people. And that means basically democratic practice. If we think that the democratic institutions in our country are being eroded by our own people, in Bangladesh by Bangladeshis, in India by Indians, then we have something to worry about. It doesn't matter where which force comes in, they will come in because there is this greed, okay? And so as long as the democratic principles and the democratic practice is, strong, wherever that is strong, there will not be another incident so soon. So that's my reckoning.
Thank you so much for those responses. They were very interesting. We're getting close to wrapping this up, so I want to end on a positive note, if possible. I got a question here. Someone is asking, what is your optimistic view and advice? And maybe we could start with Paul and be brief and concise.
View about what?
About the state of the world, I assume.
So I'm usually a positive person, and I try to stay that way around the climate, around what's going on in the world. It's difficult in this last year. But I think the things that give me optimism are the people I've met, and I'll refer back to the Cubans that I've met, to the people I've met at this conference, to the students I teach, to the interactions I have when I smile at someone and say hello in the morning, and they smile back. And I think we have to take it at this point almost to that level of interpersonal interaction, and how can we talk to people who we disagree with and do it amicably, and learn where they're coming from, where we're coming from. The second piece I would say to that, and I'm going to try to be brief, is that in my work in this last decade, looking at the Cold War, looking at the American response, looking at the technology, and looking at the wonder and ingenuity these people had as engineers, working in a place like the Arctic that is incredibly hostile, that they were comparing to working on the surface of the moon, they did things that you could never imagine. For me, it was drilling through a mile of ice in 1960 and getting those samples back. Or the scientists I work with who designed instruments that measure things that 20 years ago you could never measure. Humans are smart and ingenious, and I think coming back to your sort of fundamental democracy with a small d on there, if we can work together to solve these problems, we'll be better off. But I really believe it doesn't happen at the government level above us. It happens with every one of us in the room here, talking to each other, getting involved in that small d democracy, debating things, respecting others. And that gives me hope when I see it. And this conference the last couple of days gives me incredible hope, because I see people talking who disagree. And I see them having informed conversations, and I have met so many people who fascinate me here and are so smart and thinking differently. We just have to figure out how to respect that thinking differently. And that in this country, sadly, has diminished in the last couple of years. But I think if we can get that back, and I think if we can have a goal to work toward as a group, that gives me hope.
Yeah, well, based on what I said before, I think the way forward is to recognize reality. Reality is that the world is at war. The war is not between one country and another country or groups of countries, is between the principle of freedom and the principle of totalitarianism, social control, dehumanization, enslavement of humanity. The only hope is if freedom, the side of freedom, fights that war. I think clearly that before January the 20th, 2025, freedom was totally losing, and almost irreversibly. And now it's not winning, but chances are much better. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I also agree with the fact that it'll be the people. In 1971, when our country became independent, it was the Nixon administration that was there, and Nixon and Kissinger were dead against the independence of Bangladesh. So but the people, the American people, were very much, in favor of us, and they did take to the streets. They stopped ships, cargo loads of ammunitions being sent to Pakistan, in kayaks. They went into the Boston port, and they started obstructing those ships. It was the American people who did that. And look, we became independent. So, if our people also played their part. It was a people's war. It wasn't just India. There's a narrative saying it was India who helped you. Of course, India helped us, and they trained us. But it was these people who has said, enough is enough. We're not taking it anymore. You're not going to come and kill us and rape our women anymore. And they were farmers, they were students, they were ordinary people. So it's when ordinary people rise up, and they have in the past, why not now? So that is our hope, and that is my optimism. I also think And that's not so much of an optimism, but I also think nature will teach us a lesson soon. It did with COVID, why not again? Worse.
Thank you. So here is another very interesting question, I would say. Someone is asking, which country is a great example to follow and why? I think, Ernesto, do you want to take this one to begin with?
Sure. Today, I would say our dear neighbors, Argentina. I think Argentina is changing 180 degrees. It was becoming a total nightmare of corruption, poverty, and thanks to a very courageous leader, and I think courageous leadership is totally necessary, which is Javier Milei. They are turning the economy, but much more than that. They are fighting corruption. They are fighting structure of organized crime, which is cross-border and affects Brazil as well. They are conceiving Argentina as part of the democratic West and not part of a global South, which was basically the old Maoist concept of the third world, revamped. And if I may, also Chile, because of a different, so Argentina for those reasons, among others. No, because the question of being able to share ideas and different perspectives, I think that's key. And that doesn't exist anymore in Brazilian universities, for example. And here, I can say things that I cannot say in Brazilian universities, right? So I'm very thankful for the sort of opportunity that I have here. But no, the new leader of Chile, José Antonio Cast, which I'm honored to consider a friend, he always says that, we have to fight for our values, but always with a smile. Sometimes I can't, but I try. I try my best, and so I'll try to end with that note. Okay, thank you.
I think I wouldn't go for countries, but for immediate concern is we just recently had a Gen Z rebellion in Bangladesh, we didn't go the way it was supposed to go. But okay, so it had to be rescued. But Nepal had one. And it's astounding. You have a prime minister as a youngest prime minister in the world. We used to be a rapper. He's still rapping, and they're taking all they didn't make the mistake of entering in. Okay, they had a mass uprising of students, but immediately 2 students were inducted in as ministers. Nepal did not do that. They elected interim government. The first thing the interim government did was to announce elections. The respect for democratic rule was there in the youth of Nepal. It was not there in the youth of Bangladesh. So I think the youth of Bangladesh definitely can learn from Nepal.
And I'm going to keep it local because I live in Vermont, and it is an example of that small d people's democracy in a lot of ways that we don't see in the rest of this country. We have a tradition called town meeting every March, where the state shuts down and people do exactly what you've done here, and they go to their town hall or their town church or some town place, and instead of marking a paper ballot, they talk about issues. Do we buy a new fire engine? Do we drill a well? And how much money are we going to spend for it? And people talk to each other there. And I think if we can bring back that kind of democracy, in some ways it matters a lot less who's in Washington, D.C., and the country in particular. But it's this idea of democracy as people talking to each other and with each other and learning from each other and making those decisions that way. I think if I had to pick a favorite, and I landed in Vermont from the landscape, not from the government, but I think it's a really intriguing thing to think about of how do we re-inject democracy into this country at the level of 100 people sitting in a room, or 150 people sitting in a room, who are neighbors, or in this sense are an intentional community who's come together, who are not neighbors. There are people from around the world here, but we're having these kinds of discussions. And obviously, the three of us on this panel don't agree, but we're having a civil discussion and exchanging ideas. And I will not agree with Ernesto on many things, but I've learned things from him today that I would not have learned if we hadn't have had this conversation. And I think that's my big take home for what I would like to see.
All right, so we have 2 minutes left, and I would actually like to pose a question, primarily to Magna, and that is, from your perspective, what can everyone in this room learn from indigenous peoples and indigenous epistemology?
I've learned so much from indigenous people. I didn't know how to light a fire, with woods. They taught me. And I said that, hey, how come I don't know this and they know? They're closer to nature. They share with nature. I learned from their songs. They have beautiful songs. I mean, one of my, I actually wrote I translated many of their songs into my own vernacular language, and sometimes in English as well. I learned from their struggles as well. So one of the songs was about, it's like a lullaby, which they sing for babies to go to sleep. And they are saying that, oh, stars, come down to us and we will tell you stories through the night. How beautiful is that? Stars. And I mean, we say, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, from here to there. But there, the stars come down to them and they tell them stories. It is this change of perspective that really grabs me. I mean, that really, I think we have to learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights and for all of these very interesting words. I feel that you have all brought something very important to the table, and most importantly, facilitated a communication across borders of all kinds. So please, everybody, give them a hand.
Also, thank you so much for those brilliant questions.
Yes, thank you very much to the audience.